Space Talks with Z is hosted by America's Future Series great friend and advisor, Zaheer Ali. Space Talks with Z provides a forum for thought leaders to share insights and recommendations on how America and its allies can stay at the forefront of exploration, commercialization, and defense of space. Please visit our website to register to see all of Z's content and our many other programs for free at www.americas-fs.org.
Welcome, folks, to another episode of Space Talks with Z. Thanks so much for joining. We love to thank our sponsors, Comtech and Zero North, for making this possible. We are, of course, part of the America's Future Series. And today with us, we have Erin Miller of the Space ISAC. Welcome, Erin. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm glad to be back.
Yeah, no, we always love to have Erin share her insights. Today, we're going to be doing a little bit of a deeper dive into the ISAC itself, its operations, and the Watch Center, which was recently stood up. But before we jump in, Erin, can I just ask you, you are the head of the Space ISAC, which is part of the National Center for Cybersecurity. You're the executive director. Could you talk about that role and what the ISAC is? What does information sharing and analysis really mean in this context, and what your team is doing?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here to chat with you about Space ISAC. And yes, as we have opened our operational watch center, then we now are really embodying the full momentum of having information sharing take place. And so Space ISAC, going back a few years, we stood up in 2019 as a result of the White House asking for the public and private sector to start working together in an ISAC model. The other critical infrastructure sectors have had a lot of success by standing up an ISAC and having their industry represented in that ISAC, giving them a mechanism to all enter into the same information sharing agreement and focus on all threats, all hazards for their sector. So that's what we're doing for the space industry. We have a burgeoning commercial space sector that we all know is anticipated to reach $1 trillion by 2040. So with all of that,
yes,
it's an investment that's underway, then we have to recognize the increase in the attack surface and realize the huge benefit of doing information sharing so that we can have collective defense. So that's what Space ISAC is all about, is addressing collective defense. The National Cybersecurity Center, headquartered in Colorado, operates the Space ISAC, which is also headquartered in Colorado. And we just love the fact that we have such a density of aerospace companies and space sector that have come together in the state, but also across the globe. We have over 70 members that represent across the entire world in the Space ISAC. To be able to do this information sharing and vulnerability disclosure to better protect their space assets.
So this is a really amazing story of a very successful public-private partnership. Sometimes the public doesn't always understand how these things get done, but it's really critical, clearly, that the industry comes together with government agencies in a neutral space, which is what you guys provide. In terms of how you operationalize this, you have different members. You have, I believe, the Space Force, Air Force that are a part of this, and the view of space as critical infrastructure is also relatively new in thinking. In really in the last 5 to 10 years has that come to a point. Can you talk more about how this is operationalized on a day-to-day basis, how the members interact, and what their benefits are in concrete terms, perhaps?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're right that we've only started to realize over the past decade how dependent we are on space systems, and that all of the existing 16 critical infrastructure sectors are actually dependent on our space systems. So as we operationalize the Space ISAC, then our first goal was to stand up a watch center and a vulnerability lab. So we have the watch center now operational. As of the end of March of this year, we were able to achieve our initial operational capability. And the model has always been to include public and private sector analysts in our watch center and give them the tools needed to track the adversary through the ground into space. So we look at all of the segments as part of the definition of a space system. So ground is included, the link segment, space, as well as the launch community and the user, when we're looking at that comprehensive, holistic view of the space system. And our threat scenarios that we've identified for the Watch Center analysts to monitor for are all based on that definition that our members put together probably a couple of years ago, 2020, pretty early in the stand-up of the Space ISAC. So we have an information sharing working group that oversees the information sharing scope in the Space ISAC. It's a very popular group, and it meets every single week. So you can see, from those conversations, how much interest there is in really ensuring that we have the right rules in place to do information sharing so that it's an operational capability that the industry can rely on. And we have a mechanism to share with our government partners and vice versa. So the goal is that we have bi-directional information sharing, and that's one of the benefits to the members, as they have access to our Watch Center, which does bi-directional information sharing between public and private sector, and the members receive those alerts, the actionable intelligence coming out of the Watch Center. They get to see that.
So this is really amazing, because they don't necessarily see each other's proprietary information, but because of the way the neutrality works and the model, they can get the benefit of that sharing and those alerts that come out and give them operational, actionable intelligence, as you call it. Now, one of the things about the members, and of course there may be sensitivity in disclosing exactly who the members are, but can you talk about the size and scale of the members? Is it only enterprises, as we might think of the defense contracting large companies, or is it all the way up and down to different sizes of businesses?
Yeah, we have all sizes of companies. So we have a lot of very small businesses that are in the accelerator graduate type category, where they are under $3 million of annual revenue. We created that revenue model for just that level. So that's the only level where we look at how much money does the company make to decide how they should join, because we wanted really small companies to have access to this type of threat intelligence. And then we also have a number of multinational corporations. Some of them sit on our board of directors. We have commercial, international, defense, IC type companies. We're including the whole space community so that everyone can work together. And as opposed to allowing the stovepipes that have existed of the past to continue to persist, we had to really start breaking those down even in our membership approach. So we have new emerging tech companies that are focused on artificial intelligence, machine learning, that are applying that to space systems. We have blockchain companies focused on space systems. And then companies that do a lot of work in cybersecurity, just generally speaking, they're cybersecurity companies, but they've started to specialize in applications to space systems. Yeah, like Spider Oak, if you're familiar with them, they're doing a fantastic job really looking at the specifics associated with protecting a space system from a cybersecurity perspective.
So this is, again, another part of why it's so amazing that the Space ISAC is within the National Center for Cybersecurity, is because these domains, not to be too geeky, but it's kind of like space and time. Space and cyber are inextricably linked. Mm-hmm. So this is really interesting. Now you mentioned a couple things there. You mentioned AI, and you mentioned hardware as well. So maybe we can jump into a couple of those ideas. One of them would be looking at some of the recent legislation that has put a focus on things like supply chain and different hardware, both the infrastructure bill and the CHIPS Act. How is the Space ISAC interacting with that, leveraging it, tracking that?
Yeah, good question. So that's a really current issue within Space ISAC, because we're constantly being told by our members that supply chain concerns are an issue. And so our Watch Center is addressing 4 threat scenarios right now because it's at initial operational capability. But going forward, we will be designing and developing out visualizations and issuing alerts specific to supply chain concerns. We also stood up a vulnerability lab, and the vulnerability lab takes a look at hardware and software testing that needs to take place so that we can give a surety and confidence that a commercial space system is ready for deployment. And
wow.
Yeah, this is, it's not new because this has been done for space systems in the past, and the current But a lot of times the commercial tests that are unclassified are not made as fervent or pervasively available. And that's really what we want to do, is kind of overwhelm the industry a little bit with access to commercial tests that are endorsed by other commercial sector companies. So we're using the community approach, because the Space ISAC is a community where everyone has a vote, and they can say that, yes, this test is necessary. We would agree that you should do this before you deploy your space system. And then it gives new emerging companies that are looking to create new ways of testing to have a platform to expose their hardware or software test to the rest of the industry. And so this is that's one facet of CHIPS, is looking at the supply chain and looking at how we're testing up and down the whole system. But another thing that we're really concerned about and interested in is making sure that semiconductors and advanced manufacturers are incorporating security best practices into everything that they do, since those make their way into the space system, but also having the workforce available to do that. So Space ISAC really takes it seriously when we're looking at recruiting the future talent pipeline. Then we have a fellowship program where someone who wants to learn about cybersecurity, space, and intelligence, if they're about to graduate from college, then this is a great program for them to get involved in before they actually make their way to the industry. And they can also work in the lab too.
So it's kind of a not necessarily a postdoctorate, but like a post whatever degree, learning training position that they can take and then go from there out into industry. So these are really amazing programs. Coming back to what you said earlier, one of the things that's becoming really clear is that, as you mentioned, you're overwhelming the industry with access. You've got scaled access. So really anybody. I know a lot of startup founders via our program here. If they're putting hardware in space, then they had better be probably reaching out to one of these programs, whatever's the right fit, so that they're from inception really part of this community of security. And one thing I wanted to ask, so your vulnerability lab kind of sits parallel to like Underwriter's Lab or a NIST. In terms of the way it's providing certifications, but it's unique compared to those in that the community is really driving this rather than some kind of overarching authority driving it. How do you see that evolving in the future? For example, with emerging technologies like AI. It's dominated the news cycle. I'm sure you're tracking this and working with this in different ways, and robotics and other technologies that are going to start influencing, pushing on these two domains quickly if they're not already.
Yeah, well, it's probably no surprise to you that the Watch Center and our visualization tools do already incorporate AI. It's very controlled techniques that we're using. So we're still working on, how to mature those capabilities and apply them across the board. But for now, it's really entrenched in our RF interference threat scenario, where we can actually get notifications from the AI as to whether or not interference is taking place and whether or not it thinks that, we should be concerned about it, if it's purposeful, and also predictive analysis is involved in that. But I think, people have asked me about cyber threat intelligence using AI. I think in the future, then we will have a lot of non-open AIs that are more proprietary, closed solutions that are made available to analysts. And that will be a really instrumental tool for them to be able to do rapid analysis in a timely fashion. That's enabling the Space ISAC analysts as they're looking across domains and also across the different aspects of a space system, their different sources. We have so many things at our disposal that using an AI tool to be able to power through that is going to be very helpful to an analyst. But I certainly want to be cautious, as we move forward on that, and ensure that we are listening to industry and we're understanding what are the best practices to not become over dependent on an artificial intelligence tool like that. That's, something that I think we're all thinking about right now. And then, as it applies to space systems themselves, not the analytical tools, but the actual space systems, I know there are a number of Space ISAC member companies that are leading the way and addressing, how use artificial intelligence. And we have a community of interest called the AI/ML community of interest that we stood up, I'm going to say at least 2 years ago. It was one of the very first communities of interest that Space ISAC members said, we have to start talking about offensive, defensive uses of AI/ML. They're working on a white paper that should be available to the public to talk about how those interact with space systems and what we should be concerned about and thinking of in the future.
And now AI is kind of a beast of its own in many ways in terms of technology. And in this conversation so far, we've talked about it mostly as a tool. And this is a little bit of an odd question, but given your experience thinking about how attack surfaces evolve and having watched them in real time, pretty much probably in the last decade, yourself evolve in the space and cyber intersection, how do you see the attack surface of AI itself evolving? Because if we are starting to create AI systems and tools for offensive and defensive, for both offensive use and countermeasures in this domain, are they themselves going to have their own attack surfaces that could be undermined in different ways? Is this kind of like, it almost seems like a nested for loop, right? You're stuck in this loop. How do you see people breaking that? Is that where we have to draw the line of humans controlling versus overly trusting the AI? How do you see that evolving a little bit?
Yeah, I think I know where you're going with that. I can definitely see the picture that you're painting there. That is a concern. I would say that we have to consider it part of the attack surface. I hadn't really got that far in my thought process, but when we laid out the different segments that are the definition of a space system, then we included business systems as a key part of that. And the mission is another aspect, so some people have their business systems and their mission systems completely separate, as they really should. And in a lot of cases, then, as those attack surfaces grow, then there are different teams that are out there to address them respectively. So in Space ISAC, then we have really tried to focus on that with our member companies and ask them, do you have someone who does cybersecurity for space in your company? And they would be forecasting through how the attack surface is growing with AI tools being incorporated and that being part of the mission system or the mission platform, as well as the business team also looking at the same thing. So I think there are ways to address that under the current constructs that we have in Space ISAC. And I encourage, companies to be thinking about that too, because you're asking a really important question. As new technologies are made available that could be incorporated across every aspect of every part of what we do, then we have to think of that as increasing the attack surface.
That's amazing. Thank you for framing that so well. And it's really interesting that we're here talking about cybersecurity, security in space, information, and then suddenly, clearly, right, what you said there about, hey, people should be designing these things separately. So there's design thinking that also is coming out of a lot of the work you guys are doing in the learnings and the information sharing about, okay, the next generation, how are we thinking about designing these systems? Do you envision the vulnerability lab putting out design best practices at some point, or are those already being published?
Yeah, the vulnerability lab certainly has the capability to do that if there's a company that really wants to lead the way on that. It seems like, it's a big, what we're trying to tackle there is a big enough topic that it's probably multiple companies coming together with their resources and their tests. Right now, there's a really big emphasis in the vulnerability lab to address software bill of materials. And software bill of materials has some maturity that needs to take place, where there's a common standard and expectation for how we use SBOMs, and the Space Force and the Air Force, as well as companies like Microsoft and NetRise, who have really championed this conversation with us, then they're going to start using the lab for that purpose. My anticipation is that they'll be producing a lot of great resources for the community by the end of the year.
Oh, that's amazing. And And you're talking about the SBOM, and part of that has to be the discussion of how to track your open source vulnerabilities
Mhm.
moving forward, right? Because so much, particularly on the commercial side, so much is open source leveraged. And do you see that as a separate discussion and needing its own kind of infrastructure, or do you think that that's rolled into what you guys are doing already? Looking at and tracking that, because I know when I was still at NASA, that was a big challenge that we were asked to do is to step back and provide lists of all the open source we're using everywhere it was, and when we looked at that, I think the CIO may have wanted to go somewhere and cry because it was just this massive spaghetti list of vulnerabilities because people were using there was no version control of what open source they were using, nobody monitoring the patching. I mean, it maybe seems hyper operational, but those are that's where we get snake bit, I guess, isn't it, at times?
Yeah, well, that is certainly a focus area of the vulnerability lab right now. It's one of the first topics that our members latched onto and said, this is a huge vulnerability for the industry, is all this open source code, and we need to address this. We have companies that are doing excellent work in the space of creating like a cybersecurity for space company, only it's an SBOM for space company, where they're
Interesting.
creating the resources and making them available through the vulnerability lab. So I see, that will be a pillar of what we're doing probably indefinitely. But as we evolve, then there's other facets of vulnerability testing that will come up. In particular, I know we've talked about supply chain a lot today, but there's a company called Proof Labs out of New Mexico that's going to be making their services available through the vulnerability lab to address some supply chain concerns. And I expect more and more companies that will show up that have a test that they perform that isn't maybe widely known, that we need some standards associated with it, like RF standards for testing is something that we've been talking about. There's a lot of kind of unknowns that are starting to surface where people go, we've never really standardized how to do this because the industry didn't demand it, but now we need to.
I see. And that's very interesting because you think of ISO or IEEE or some of the or SPIE, some of those organizations that set a lot of these standards in the commercial world. Where you go look up antenna and specs and or different specifications, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're setting a lot of those. So, do you see this coming up and being led by the Space ISAC, or do you think eventually it's actually needed to be handed over to the industry bodies to agree on, or do you think it's a constant feedback loop?
Oh yeah, definitely a feedback loop. Yeah, we're not a standard setting organization and we don't want
Okay.
one. But working with the other entities that has been something we've been doing since the beginning. We stood up a Space Policy Directive 5 task force as soon as it came out in September 2020. And since that time, we've been working with standard setting organizations to kind of have that feedback loop so that whatever we're discussing and stating that should be considered as potentially a standard, then they're aware and they could start taking that on if they wanted to. But these things are pretty relatively iterative, I would say. So as the space industry ventures into new things, like moving into this new world of cislunar, it's not so new. I'm always reminded of that looking at your background, but but now we really made it a commercial endeavor. So
Right.
so that's going to open up a whole new conversation about standards and expectations for how we do business in space.
So let's talk about the future a little more, and where you see the Space ISAC and its capabilities evolving alongside this economy that we're in a little bit of a consolidation period. We've had some things like Virgin Orbit happen. There's other consolidation happening in the industry, but this is kind of a normal cycle. It happened in tech in the early 2000s. There was the bubble got burst, and then actually after that, it's driven even harder and to heights that we perhaps had not envisioned at the time. One can almost expect space to do the same thing economically. Now, as that grows, right, as we saw coming out of the early 2000s, the driving emergence and growth of e-commerce, it led to massive amounts of vulnerabilities and breaches, like the famous Experian one. I don't know, I had identity lock or something, they had to give us all for a year because I had some system, I had some interaction with that, so my data was gone. Right. We want to prevent that, of course, in space, and we've watched that happen. How do you see these things evolving in terms of on the commercial side, whether it's operational consortia, whether it's different standards? We already discussed a little bit about standards, but are there lessons to learn from what we saw happen in the last 20 years with internet and e-commerce? Where do those lessons stop? Where do we have to invent things? Love to hear your thoughts on kind of the analogies, and then this stuff is new, so we have to imagine it differently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's definitely lessons to be learned from other critical infrastructure sectors. And like the financial sector has done a really great job of monitoring their threats and detecting them, and having members of their ISAC involved in that information sharing. It's a little bit different because space isn't as heavily regulated as the financial sector, but it's also, I think it resembles more of like, I don't want to make this sound disparaging because it's not at all, but it's a very distributed teams approach when you think of,
okay,
because we have companies all over the world that work together. Like every space system is made of components that come from all over the world. And then you have teams that are required to come together from multiple locations to operate a space system, to monitor and detect for threats and vulnerabilities against that space system. And then people all over the world are using that space system at any given time, whether they know it or not, so it's highly distributed. And the nature of, where we're going, where our whole internet is based on the success of space systems, and then also our ability to respond to natural disasters dependent on space systems, our ability to do precision agriculture also dependent on space systems. Like it's highly distributed work that we're doing. And I think that creates a little bit of a different dynamic that we need to start acknowledging and thinking through. And that team of teams approach is going to be different than maybe how other sectors have addressed protecting their systems. So for example, we have a threat scenario where we're monitoring for purposeful RF interference. And that sounds pretty basic to most cybersecurity professionals, interfering with the link that connects the two pieces of the system together. And when you interfere like that with a terrestrial network, then obviously it's a cyber attack. But historically in the space community, then we've thought of spectrum as maybe like a separate thing. And it's not a cyber attack when you're looking at spectrum. But we have to think of this as an end-to-end ground into space. It's all one system. Satellites are just nodes on the network, and really address it from a holistic point of view, and shift our mindset in that direction rapidly.
Yeah, and then that's really amazing, because you're right. People think of this as, they think of it as blocks, and they think of these things as separate. But if you look at it as everything's just a node on the network, and the physical location is actually irrelevant, only insofar as it affects how the link is set up and what the vulnerabilities of the link, etc., would be. Then that actually it's not reductive. It's actually beautifully simplifying, because then you can just look at it as a network model and do network analysis on it, which we know how to do at some level. But then you also have strange effects, right? Like I was reading about a recent article that they've confirmed that the massive underwater volcano eruption in Tonga, near Tonga, a couple of years ago, actually affected satellite comms, which was kind of out of the blue to me, at least. You don't think of it. So when you're looking at these threats, and then you have ionospheric issues. So this is a very, it's not a closed network, I guess, is the question, is the point of what I'm thinking about. So how do you, or how does the team think about this, in the fact that there's natural effects that are directly input, whereas perhaps with other networks, we haven't really thought of it that way, except on, an occasional natural disaster like a hurricane and an earthquake, which would take something down. But with space, it's, you have to monitor the sun to see what it's going to do to your, in terms of the EM environment, depending on where you are, what orbit, what side of the Earth you are on at any given point in time. How does that integrate with everything else that you guys are doing?
Yeah, I guess I can tie that back to your prior question where you're asking about future. So the Space ISAC is definitely looking at space weather impacts on systems. We're also looking at, GNSS interference and incorporating those into our watch center. There's a lot of things that we can also begin to exercise because there's been investments made in these topics. A lot of people who are incredibly smart have come together, recognized, like there's a P&T executive order, council's been meeting for years on this topic. So we want to take all of the lessons that are learned from those experiences people have already had and translate it now to the operational point of view. What actionable intelligence does the industry really need to know in order to perform their day-to-day mission and make this, it's in our public interest to have access to this information and do controlled information sharing. So it's made available to member companies of the Space ISAC. So they view it as part of managing their all threats, all hazards environment.
I see. Amazing. So, we've covered a lot of ground, a lot of varied topics. But looking forward also, you mentioned cislunar. How do you see the challenges evolving into that domain? Are they the same as what we're going to see? What we're seeing in it's primarily the LEO and a little bit of the GEO when you think about some of our critical assets out there. But right, the orbital economy, right, and growing from there commercially into the cislunar. How do you see these systems and needs evolving to support those, or is it just nodes on the network, or do things change somehow?
Well, it's definitely new infrastructure and new environments, and the commercial nature of it means that it's important to Space ISAC that we're able to partner with those companies and understand maybe what information they need to have at their disposal to protect their systems. I think, you can't use the current cyber threat intel tools for everything. So we have to evolve our cyber threat intelligence capabilities to align with the needs of space systems. I'll say the Aerospace Corporation and the Aerospace Sparta framework that they put together is a fantastic step in that direction so that we can map Sparta and MITRE ATT&CK and have machine-to-machine threat intel sharing for the space community. We also stood up a cislunar affinity group that's working with AIAA, so we can partner with them and their cislunar team to address some of the threats and concerns to moving into cislunar from a commercial point of view. And I know that this year during our Value of Space Summit in October, this is going to be a hot topic. It was last year. Lots of great discussions come out of this. I mentioned workforce earlier and tabletop exercises. I would expect both of those topics to come up many times during Value of Space Summit, where we'll have panelists that are talking about incorporating a diverse workforce into the future cislunar economy and unique ways to approach that conversation and come at it from a different viewpoint and angle than we've ever done before to recruit new talent. And then also running tabletop exercises that include these different consortia or commercial entities that have formed over time that are sometimes doing operational things, sometimes not, but they all have their own important role. And the Space ISAC, being that it is highly operational, we want to encourage that discussion so that we can do information sharing across the entire commercial sector.
Amazing. And so that's the Value of Space Summit, and it's October. What were the dates?
It is the third week. Sorry, bear with me 1 second.
No, all good.
You think
third week of October.
Committed to memory, but it is 16 through 19. And that's the same week that we held it last year. So we're really excited that people have saved the dates on their calendar and they're planning the third week of October in Colorado Springs.
All right, folks, we'll include that date in along with the Space ISAC links in the information below for the talk, so that you can get registered and not miss it. Uh, Particularly, as we're hearing, it's not just about the bigs. It's all sides and scales. So, Erin, we've covered a lot of ground today. Really appreciate you joining us and doing this deeper dive into what the Space ISAC is doing, the amazing work the Watch Center is doing. Before we close out, I want to give you an opportunity to just share kind of your vision for the future and words of wisdom for people who might not be members and who are or who are thinking who are we also get a lot of space adjacent viewership. So helping them understand it would be and think about this would be great. So last word over to you, Erin.
Yeah, I would say, we live in a really important time right now where our space technology is evolving so rapidly that we don't even understand the full gravity of what it means to be connected to space systems on a daily basis. And if you work in an adjacent sector to the space community, you're not actually working in a space company, then take the time to think about how you are connected and dependent on space systems from your either industry or critical infrastructure point of view. If you work in the cybersecurity community or not, then this is highly relevant to your world, because we're all connected to networks and systems at any given time. And we should understand what that threat landscape and attack surface looks like and how it might be impacting us personally or professionally. And really imagining, how we're going to use all of these systems going forward as we move into being in commercial space station environments, maybe for business or personal, right? We can do travel,
Right.
for leisure, or for work. And then also as we establish ourselves in cislunar and on the moon, depending on your definition there of cislunar, and beyond. So there's a lot to think about here. And I really encourage you, whether you're part of space or not, to start thinking through it.
Well, thank you again for joining us, Erin. Truly appreciate you taking the time and appreciate you and your team's work. Folks, we'll have a lot of info. Please do reach out to me on LinkedIn. I know Erin's available there as well. Take advantage of the resources. But thanks again for joining us on America's Future Series Space Talks with Z. It's been a real pleasure, Erin. Thank you.
Thank you, Z.